On the morning of March 12, 1973, when the light had barely settled over the port of Baltimore and the air carried that mixed smell of salt, diesel, and bread baking somewhere in Fells Point, Marlene Kline opened the building's mailbox on East Fayette Street and found a thick envelope with an Alaska stamp. It was not advertising. It did not have the disposable lightness of commercial mail. The paper was heavier, the postmark was sharply stamped, and her name appeared typed with an almost formal care, as if each letter had to justify the crossing of thousands of miles to that narrow hallway, where the radiator knocked like an impatient clock, typical of an old steam-heated building, with pipes cracking as the system went in and out of pressure. Even before reading, her mind moved ahead to the place where choices begin to tighten. If she accepted, there would be higher pay and a restart. If she stayed, she would continue in a city that seemed to compress life into small daily threats. The letter offered a job at Providence Hospital in Anchorage as a laboratory technician. The text admitted the cost of living was high, but mentioned relocation assistance, a benefit that in that period usually came as partial reimbursement for transporting belongings and airfare, conditioned on a minimum length of stay. In Baltimore in 1973, with rumors of cuts, inflation at the market, and a tension spreading through the blocks, that envelope seemed to contain an exit and, at the same time, a debt to everything she would leave behind. The bus routes and familiar streets, the predictable shifts, the physical closeness of Dundalk. Marlene was 26 with steady hands and short nails, and had worked in the hematology section of Baltimore City Hospitals on Edison Highway since 1968. It was a high-volume public complex, with laboratory routines sustained by forms, labels, and logbooks, and results that had to move quickly between wards and the emergency department. She had learned to do white blood cell counts with precision and to listen to the centrifuge the way someone recognizes an off note, distinguishing by sound when there was tube imbalance or a worn bearing. She liked things that could be measured: hemoglobin, prothrombin time, glucose levels, values that came out as numbers and required basic quality control, repetition when there were discrepancies, checking reagents and standards. In 1973, it worked almost like a refuge. Outside, Baltimore was changing tone. On the number 13 bus, heading up North Avenue, conversations turned around rising prices at the market, gasoline that no longer seemed guaranteed, neighborhoods people avoided after sundown, and that persistent sense that money went less far each week, with basic items fluctuating at the counter and the register. On television, images for Vietnam still appeared, even as the withdrawal advanced, and at the same time, a word began to hover over dinner tables like a cloud without a defined shape, but heavy: Watergate, entering the evening news and reappearing in the next day's papers. She took the envelope inside, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and put water on to boil in the small kitchen, where steam mixed with the smell of hot metal from the stove. The apartment was narrow, put together little by little. A second-hand sofa, a table with one leg propped up by a piece of cardboard, a shelf with laboratory technique books, and a few novels she never finished. On the wall, a calendar with a photo of the Inner Harbor before the renovations, and a pen circle marking April 1st, the lease renewal date, reminding her of deposit, receipt, and adjustment. When she opened the letter, the paper made a dry sound, almost final. The text was direct. Providence Hospital needed technicians with experience in clinical analyses. Anchorage was growing, and demand for tests increased with the population and with workplace accidents tied to construction and oil, at a moment when the state was drawing labor and services and when hospitals had to cover everything from outpatient routine to emergencies. They asked for a response within 2 weeks, short enough to impose urgency, long enough to demand reckoning. Late that afternoon, Marlene folded the letter, put it in her purse, and went down to buy milk at the corner market. The neighborhood, near Jonestown, had brick facades and windows with heavy curtains. The street showed the common were of central areas, with uneven sidewalks, worn steps, doors with old paint. A group of children played ball on the sidewalk, and an older woman swept her stoop with short motions, as if sweeping her own thoughts. Marlene nodded in greeting and kept going. At the counter, the owner remarked, without looking much, that the price of sugar had gone up again, a reflection of increases already showing up in pantry items and affecting bakeries and home kitchens. She paid and walked back holding the bag carefully, as if the milk glass could break under the weight of what she had to decide. The next day, March 13th, in the city hospital's lab, fluorescent light always made skin look a little paler, and the room had the constant shine of clean benches and labeled containers. The smell of isopropyl alcohol and latex soaked into clothing, mixed with the odor of disinfectants from the corridors and drawer rooms. Marlene showed the letter to Helen Dorsey, an older technician in bacteriology, with a short laugh but attentive eyes. Helen read it, whistled softly, and said she knew a cousin who had gone to Fairbanks and come back talking about long nights and a silence that made you want to talk to the radio. She said Anchorage had wind and that in winter people walked fast, as if every minute outside were an expense, and that the cold demanded planning for clothing and getting around. Marlene listened, put the letter away again, and returned to what the bench required. A tube of dark blood waited for centrifugation, and the routine seemed to ask her not to think about anything beyond what was in front of her eyes. Labels, times, results to deliver. But the decision was not adventure. It was calculation. Baltimore in 1973 offered familiarity and, at the same time, the feeling that the ground was shifting. City hospitals was large, served many poor people, and Marlene saw up close what crisis did to real bodies. Anemia in women working double, infections in poorly treated wounds, uncontrolled diabetes in those who could not afford the recommended diet. She did not judge. She recorded, labeled, spun samples, called nurses when a result came back dangerous, following internal communication and urgency protocols. The work had purpose, and precisely for that reason, it had weight. Sometimes, walking home, she crossed blocks with empty buildings and broken windows and felt the city asked more than she had to give, as if urban were a constant noise behind everything. That week, the Alaska letter stayed on the table beside the calendar. Marlene began making lists. She wrote salary and noted the number Providence offered. She wrote Anchorage rent and left it blank because values varied, and she still had no concrete references beyond what one heard from people who had gone north. She called the number in the letter during lunch from a pay phone in the hospital corridor with a coin slot and a cold surface. On the other end, a man with a Midwestern accent explained there were apartments near Lake Otis Parkway, but that prices and availability changed quickly with the arrival of workers and families. He said the hospital helped with the move. He also said winter was still present in March, but spring would come the Alaska way, with uneven thaw and days that lengthened. Marlene wrote it down on paper with the hospital logo. The pay phone smelled of metal and disinfectant, and the corridor carried the distant sound of carts and hurried footsteps, as if the whole building breathed haste. On Friday, March 16th, she went to visit her mother, Ruth Kline, in Dundalk in a small house near Eastern Avenue, with a yard where the clothesline creaked and where the wind, on certain days, brought the smell of water and the surrounding industry. Ruth worked part-time at a bakery and had arthritis in her hands, which made repetitive tasks slower and more painful, especially on cold days. She liked to keep the house clean. The smell of lemon detergent was constant, mixed with the flour and yeast she brought home from work. Marlene arrived with a simple cake and the letter in her purse. She waited for the coffee to be ready, waited for her mother to talk about the price of butter, about a neighbor robbed in the mall parking lot, about someone's nephew who had come back for Vietnam different. Only then, without raising her voice, she put the letter on the table. Ruth read slowly, moving her lips without sound. When she finished, she folded the sheet with the care of someone folding a towel. She said Anchorage was too far, and that it was not only distance. It was another life with climate and cost that could not be compared to what they knew. She said Marlene had always been one to keep to herself, to do the right thing, and that the right thing sometimes was not to throw yourself into the unknown. Then, as if remembering something she did not want to say, Ruth spoke of a time when Baltimore seemed safer, when Marlene's father was still alive and worked at the port, coming home with hands that smelled of rope and fish, marks of physical work in the docks. He had died in 1966 of a heart attack, and since then Marlene had taken on part of caring for her mother, even without living with her, helping with groceries, bills, and regular presents. The mention of her father thickened the air in the kitchen. Ruth did not forbid anything. She only said that if Marlene went, it would not be a weekend trip. It would be a decision that changed how the two of them existed, with letters and phone calls replacing closeness. The catalyst came in a banal form, and for that very reason, impossible to ignore. On March 28, 1973, a cold, rainy Wednesday, Marlene left her 5:30 p.m. shift and walked to the bus stop on Lombard Street. She carried a bag with an extra lab coat and a package of pasta bought along the way, ordinary items for someone trying to keep pantry and work in order. The street was wet, reflecting yellowish lights. A car sped by, splashing water. At the stop, there were two people, a man in a factory uniform and a young woman with a folder. The bus was late, and Marlene looked at her watch. The man commented about gasoline, already getting hard to find at some stations, about rationing rumors, about how the subject appeared more and more in street conversations. The young woman did not answer. A minute later, two young men appeared from the side of a corner, soaked hoods, hands shoved into pockets. There were no screams. It was fast, in an almost administrative tone. One of the young men came close and asked for money. A hand came out of a pocket with something that could have been a knife or just a shiny piece of metal. The rain distorted everything. The man in uniform handed over his wallet. The young woman, trembling, opened her folder and showed she had nothing. Marlene felt her body react before thought and handed over her purse. One of them yanked. The strap tore. The pasta package fell into a puddle and ripped, spilling part of its contents into the dirty street water. They ran. The bus arrived right after, as if it had waited for the scene to end to keep its schedule, with the hiss of brakes and the door opening as if nothing had happened. On the bus seat, Marlene realized the purse carried more than money. It carried her ID, her hospital card, an envelope with the Alaska letter she had been carrying to reread and perhaps show someone. It also carried a small keychain with her father's name, which Ruth had given her years earlier. She got off 2 stops later, before reaching home, and went into a small precinct to file a report, following the procedure of stating time, place, and description, even knowing what that usually meant. The officer wrote it down with little hope of recovery. He said it happened all the time. He told her to be careful, a standard instruction that did not fill the concrete emptiness of what had been taken. That night, Marlene sat on the sofa and looked at her empty hands. It was not only fear. It was the sense that the city, which she defended to herself as home, had begun to charge a daily price in tension. The robbery was not the worst thing that happened in Baltimore, and she knew that. But it was personal, concrete, irrecoverable in small details. Her father's keychain gone. The letter lost to water and asphalt. The certainty that even doing everything right, she could be pulled out of her own routine by someone who did not know her. The next day, she called Anchorage again and asked for another copy of the offer. The recruiter's voice did not ask why. He only said he would send it, as if the bureaucracy of employment had its own indifferent rhythm. From there, the decision became movement. In April, Marlene began collecting cardboard boxes, asked for them at the market, stored them in the closet, as if the material reality of moving had to begin with something simple and stackable. At the hospital, she asked her supervisor for a letter of recommendation, a man who spoke little and valued punctuality, judging technicians by consistency, absence of errors, and ability to keep flow during crowded shifts. He wrote that she was reliable, that she could work under pressure, and that she had a good relationship with the team. Helen brought an old Alaska travel guide with photos of mountains and a map that looked like a drawing from another planet. She said Marlene needed to understand that adventure also had bills, more expensive food, heating, proper clothing. She told her to buy good boots and not to skimp on a coat, because the cold did not forgive weak fabric or slick soles. On May 1st, 1973, Marlene mailed her acceptance with return receipt to Providence Hospital. The letter went out from a post office on Charles Street, and she watched the clerk stamp the date, as if that stamp were the official seal of a new life ink and numbers fixing what had previously been only hypothesis. Then she walked to the inner harbor, where there were still run-down areas and areas promised for renewal. The wind carried the smell of water and rust. She stood for a few minutes watching boats, feeling at once the weight of the city and the lightness of what still had no shape, with cranes and warehouses in the background reminding her that work and movement had always been part of that place. Telling Ruth was difficult, but without explosion. Ruth fell silent, stirring coffee. Then she asked about money, about whether there would be a place to live, about what Marlene would do when she got sick. Marlene answered with facts. The hospital offered insurance, helped with the move, there were apartments. Ruth then spoke of winter, as if winter were an entity. She said the cold got into the bones and made people different, and that loneliness could be as heavy as a coat. Marlene listened. She did not promise to come back soon. She promised nothing beyond calling and writing, because bigger promises would be fragile against costs and distances. Ruth nodded, like someone accepting a tide. June arrived with humid heat in Baltimore. The lab had fans pushing warm air, and sweat mixed with the discomfort of lab coat and gloves on heavier days. The city smelled of hot asphalt and accumulated trash. Marlene worked until her last day, June 22nd, 1973, a Friday. She put away the last tubes, cleaned the bench, left the manuals in place, closed out records like someone ending an administrative cycle. Helen gave her a quick hug and an envelope with some money for emergencies, along with a handwritten list of things that might be useful. Flashlight, matches, wool socks, radio. The list seemed exaggerated for someone going to work in a hospital, not a cabin, but Marlene kept it anyway because it carried the practical experience of someone who knew the weight of winter and distance. The trip began on June 26th. Marlene left early from Dundalk, where she had spent the previous night with her mother. Ruth insisted on taking her to Baltimore/Washington International Airport, BWI, in Linthicum Heights, in an old car that creaked on curves with the sound of tired suspension and an engine asking for care. The sky was clear and the sun was already warm. On the way, Ruth talked about small things, a bread recipe, the electric bill, the neighbor who had adopted a dog, as if the everyday were a way to keep the ground firm. In the airport parking lot, Ruth stopped and kept her hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary. Then she handed Marlene a bag with sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil and a coat that had belonged to Marlene's father, too heavy for June, too symbolic to stay behind. Marlene held the bag as if it were a document. Ruth did not say, "Don't go." She only touched her daughter's face with her fingertips, as if memorizing a surface, and then stepped back, keeping her posture firm so she would not collapse there, in a place of departures and quick goodbyes. The flight had layovers: Baltimore to Chicago O'Hare, Chicago to Seattle Tacoma, and then to Anchorage. In each airport, Marlene saw hurried people, luggage, announcements, and felt the country was too large to fit into the news, with routes and connections turning distance into hours of waiting and corridors. In Seattle, the air smelled of coffee and rain. She saw men in work jackets and women with hair pinned up, all carrying their own urgencies. On the last leg, when the plane crossed clouds and began to descend, Marlene pressed her forehead to the window. She saw water, islands, then a strip of land with mountains behind it still holding snow. It was June 27th, 1973, when she stepped into Anchorage International Airport, which at that time was known as Anchorage International Airport, and only later would receive the name Ted Stevens. The air was colder than she expected for June, clean and sharp. The hospital sent a driver, a man named Don, in a heavy coat and a polite smile. He loaded her bags into the van and drove along Minnesota Drive, pointing out in the distance the line of the Chugach Mountains. He talked about the short summer and how in December the light disappeared early. He said many people came for 2 years and stayed 10. He also said grocery prices shocked people, but the salary made up for it if you did not get lost in shopping, because transportation and supply costs showed up directly on the shelves. Marlene looked out the window and saw wide streets, low houses, pickup trucks, and a sense of space almost indecent for someone coming from Baltimore's tight blocks, with open parking and a dominant sky. The temporary apartment was near Lake Otis Parkway in a simple complex. It had brown carpet, noisy heat, and a window that looked out on a line of trees. Marlene set her bags on the floor and stood in the middle of the living room, listening to a different kind of silence. It was not the absence of sound. It was a continuous sound of wind and far-off light traffic. That night, she ate a sandwich from Ruth's bag and tasted home mixed with the metallic taste of airplane travel, with a dry mouth and a head still in motion. Work at Providence Hospital began on July 2nd, 1973. The building was solid, and the lab had equipment similar to Baltimore's, but the demand was different. There were many routine tests, but also hunting injuries, road accidents, respiratory infections, and people who worked outdoors, and cases that arrived late because of distance and weather. The team was smaller, and each person did more tasks, switching between bench work, sample preparation, reading, and recording with less rigid specialization. Marlene learned quickly where everything was, how to understand the rhythm. Her co-workers were cordial, but there was a reserve typical of people who had seen others leave without warning when winter tightened. She received a new badge, and that, for some reason, hurt. Concrete proof that on paper she had become someone else with another number in another institution. In August, Anchorage seemed to vibrate with construction. There were trucks, dust, and talk about North Slope oil, about the possibility of a pipeline that would change everything, the subject circulating as economic expectation and promise of work, but also as pressure on services. In the markets, Marlene saw prices that made her take a deep breath. Expensive milk, fruit almost a luxury, fresh products with costs that revealed logistics. She learned to buy canned goods, to choose what was worth it, to compare brands and sizes. The paycheck came in, but went out quickly. She did calculations at the table with a pencil and realized the adventure had a real cost. Still, leaving work on some afternoons, she saw the sky stretch late, with a long light that did not exist in Baltimore. On certain days, the temperature was mild and the air smelled of pine. She drove a pickup borrowed from a coworker to Tinnigan Arm to watch the water rise and fall. She stood looking without hurry, as if she could relearn time, with the road cutting through the landscape and the tide imposing its own clock. The isolation, however, was not only geographic, it was emotional. Calls to Ruth were expensive, and Marlene limited the time, measuring minutes as if they were physical money. She wrote letters on plain paper, describing the work, the light, the mountains. Ruth replied talking about the bakery, the pain in her hands, neighborhood news. In September, Ruth mentioned that gasoline prices had shot up and that some stations were already limiting purchases. The country was beginning to feel, concretely, the oil crisis, with lines and restrictions entering daily life. In Anchorage, people talked about it too, but in a different tone, as if Alaska were both part of it and an exception, tied to the very subject of oil and yet dependent on supply chains. The irreversible event, the one that would give distance a definitive shape, came on October 20th, 1973, a Saturday. Marlene was in the apartment, making a grocery list when the phone rang. It was not common to receive calls. On the other end, a female voice, Ruth's neighbor, said Ruth had fallen ill and been taken to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. She said it was a stroke. She said Ruth was alive, but could not speak properly. And, as if practical details could make the news less brutal, she gave the room number, visiting hours, and said someone needed to take care of the house because bills and routine did not stop with an emergency. Marlene held the phone for a while, listening to her own heart. Then she called the hospital, asked to speak to the nursing station on the floor, and got confirmation. Ruth was conscious, but with weakness on the right side and difficulty forming words. The nurse spoke carefully, without promising full recovery, within what was said in such cases, with uncertain rehabilitation and time as a factor. Marlene looked out the window. The trees already had fewer leaves, and the air seemed colder. Alaska, which until then had been a choice, suddenly became a physical obstacle between her and her mother, measured in flights, layovers, and money. She spoke with her supervisor at Providence on Monday, October 22nd, and asked for leave. The supervisor Practical explained the team was short, but he would try to help. Marlene researched flights. In that period, with the oil crisis and fall travel, prices were high and connections complicated, with schedules that did not always fit and long waits. She had savings, but not much. She bought the fastest ticket she could find with long layovers. She left Anchorage on October 25th and arrived in Baltimore the next day, exhausted, her body still on different time zones, and her stomach tight with anxiety. At Johns Hopkins, in East Baltimore, the corridors smelled of wax and antiseptic. Marlene found Ruth in bed, thinner, her face slightly drooping on one side. Ruth tried to speak, and a trapped sound came out. Her eyes, however, were alert, and that was what hurt most. A whole presence trapped in a body that would not obey. Marlene held her mother's hand and felt dry skin, the pulse. Ruth squeezed back, weak but clear. There was no room for arguments about choices in that room. There was only the fact. Marlene had left, and now she was back, but she could not undo the distance that had existed when the stroke happened, nor rewrite the calendar. The following days were made of practical decisions. Ruth would need rehabilitation. The house in Dundalk would need someone. Marlene spoke with social workers, wrote down numbers, tried to understand what insurance covered, what required forms, what depended on referral and an opening. She felt the weight of an adult life fully underway. Bills, forms, visiting hours, the urgency of a body that needed to relearn simple movements. At the same time, the job in Anchorage waited. Marlene had only a few days of leave. She could resign and stay. She could try to bring Ruth to Alaska, something that seemed impossible with Ruth's condition and the cost. She could also return to Alaska and send money, coordinate care from a distance, accept that physical presence would not be daily, but could be constant in another way. On November 2nd, 1973, Marlene returned to Anchorage. It was not escape or abandonment. It was the possible choice within real limits. She arranged for a distant cousin of Ruth's, a woman named Jeanette, to help with groceries and visits, and hired a care service for a few hours a week, paying what she could, adjusting her budget like someone adjusting a spreadsheet with no margin. Ruth was transferred to a rehabilitation center in the Towson area. Marlene promised to call every week and visit when she could. Ruth, with speech still difficult, managed to say something that sounded like go, a short word carrying recognition that Marlene's life no longer fit only in the Dundalk kitchen. Anchorage in November already had more serious cold. The light faded early, and the streets gained a layer of ice that forced the body to walk cautiously, short steps, attention to what looked like mere shine on the asphalt. Marlene returned to the lab with a sense of displacement. The centrifuges spun the same way, the tubes had the same color, but she was not the same. The adventure now had shadow. She sent money to Baltimore, made long calls, and sometimes stared at the clock calculating East Coast time. Isolation became a daily fact, not a romantic idea. She began saving newspaper clippings about the oil crisis, about lines at gas stations, about changes in the country. In Anchorage, people talked about stocking supplies, about preparing cars for winter. Marlene bought a radio and listened to news while making simple dinners. The announcer's voice seemed to come from very far away, crossing states and time. In December 1973, the city was covered in snow. The sky was often gray, and the sun appeared low for only a few hours. Marlene learned to start the car early, to warm it, to wear layers, to recognize the difference between bearable cold and dangerous cold, the kind that required not standing still outside and not trusting long routes without preparation. At the hospital, she saw cases of hypothermia, falls on ice, children with bronchitis. The work was constant and, in a way, kept her upright. At Christmas, she received a letter from Jeanette saying Ruth was improving a little, that she could walk with help and was doing speech exercises. The letter included a short note from Ruth, written in shaky handwriting, only a few legible words. Marlene kept it as if it were a rare object, physical proof of effort and continuity. Time moved on, and 1974 arrived with the same short light. Marlene did not become a different character. She simply adjusted her body to a new geography. In February, she managed to fly to Baltimore for a few days. She found Ruth back at home, with grab bars in the bathroom and a special chair in the living room. Ruth spoke slowly, with effort, and the right side was still weak. But she was there, alive, and that was a kind of ordinary miracle, the kind that does not appear in newspapers. Marlene spent the days shopping, fixing small things, organizing medications in divided boxes, checking schedules as if they were lab results. At night, she sat beside her mother and watched television with the volume low. Baltimore seemed harder than before, or perhaps Marlene now saw it with different eyes. She saw a line at a gas station on Pulaski Highway, cars waiting, people irritated. She saw a burned building in the distance. And she also saw that the city continued to be made of small gestures. A neighbor bringing soup, someone holding a door, children running in the cold. When she returned to Anchorage at the end of February, she took her father's coat with her, now smelling of home and medicine. At the airport, boarding, she did not feel guilt as before. She felt a steady sadness, and with it, the certainty that she was sustaining two shores, life in Alaska and Ruth's life in Baltimore. The money she sent helped. The calls, even short, kept Ruth connected. Jeanette remained present. The distance was not good, but it was the structure that existed, with its costs and routines. In the spring of 1974, the light in Anchorage began to return, stretching the days. The snow melted in patches, revealing dark earth. On a Sunday in May, Marlene drove to Kincaid Park and walked a trail still damp. The air smelled of new leaves and distant sea. She stopped at a high point and saw the city's low line, and beyond it the water and the mountains. There was no sense of conquest, only of staying. She thought about how she had arrived there by a letter and by a robbery at a bus stop, by the desire to escape and the need to earn more, by fear and curiosity. She also thought about Ruth's stroke, which had marked time like a definitive stamp, before and after. None of it could be undone, and perhaps that was the simple truth of adult life. In July 1974, Marlene completed 1 year at Providence Hospital. She received a small raise and a discreet performance recognition, more payroll adjustment and internal notation than celebration. She stayed in the same complex, now with a few plants in the window and a rug bought at a bazaar. She had learned the city's routes, knew where to buy cheaper fish, knew which streets became dangerous with ice. Little by little, she built a minimal network. Helen became correspondence, and a lab co-worker, a woman named Nora, sometimes invited her to dinner. Marlene went calmly, without hurry to fit in, accepting that loneliness did not have to be total, and that company could be simple and functional. Ruth, in Baltimore, never returned to exactly how she had been. Her speech improved, but remained slow. Her right hand did not recover full strength. She came to depend on help for some tasks, and the house was adapted. Marlene visited twice a year, usually at the end of winter and in the fall, and sent money regularly. The two of them learned a new way of being family. Less physical presence, more steadiness, letters with small details, scheduled phone calls. Ruth, when she could, wrote short sentences about the weather, about a rye bread that had turned out right, about a memory of Marlene's father. Marlene kept everything in a box, along with the old Alaska guide and Helen's now crumpled list, like a domestic archive of continuity. On August 9th, 1974, on a day of clear sky and Anchorage and air with the freshness of late summer, Marlene heard on the car radio news of a presidential resignation. She parked for a few minutes, listening to the announcer's voice, but did not feel it changed her immediate daily life. What changed her life were other things. The price of milk, the bus schedule when the car would not start, the letter arriving from Baltimore in shaky handwriting, the critical result of a patient who had to be notified quickly with documentation and an internal call. The country was passing through an era of distrust and adjustment, but Marlene lived it at the level where history touches the skin, without speeches, only choices and consequences. At the end of September 1974, she received a letter from Ruth with only a few lines, but clear enough to be read without guessing. Ruth said she had managed to walk to the yard and clip a towel to the clothesline slowly with her left hand. She said the wind in Dundalk was colder and the leaves were beginning to fall. Marlene read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the box. That night, she washed the dishes, turned off the lights, and stood for a while looking out the apartment window. The street was quiet. In the distance, a car passed. The sky had stars, and the darkness seemed clean, different from Baltimore's urban darkness. Autumn in Anchorage advanced, and, with it, work bureaucracy changed too. In October 1974, Providence Hospital opened internal slots for a short training in basic immunology and quality control, something the supervisor explained as necessary to standardize results in a period when patient flow was growing and reagent costs were rising with the supply crisis, affecting purchasing and restocking. Marlene signed up more out of discipline than ambition. She began staying after her shift some nights, checking lots, adjusting controls, learning to record deviations with new rigor, with forms and signatures that provided traceability. It was a kind of learning that made sense for someone who had always sought stability in numbers. In early November, a letter arrived from Jeanette with practical news. The Dundalk Community Center had started a rehabilitation and social group for people who had suffered strokes, with transportation on set days, and Ruth had been accepted. Jeanette's handwriting was direct, but behind it was relief. Ruth left the house twice a week, did exercises, tried words patiently, and came back tired but less isolated. For Marlene, the information did not erase the distance, but it changed its texture. Her mother was not only surviving. She was returning to occupy space in the world, with a routine outside the house. In December 1974, with snow piled along the edges of streets and Christmas lights hanging in some shop windows on 4th Avenue, Marlene received an expensive call and, for that reason, a planned one. Jeanette said Ruth wanted to speak. On the other end of the line, after background noise and a silence that seemed to measure courage, Ruth formed short sentences, with pauses between words, but clear enough not to require guessing. She said she was fine. She said the rye bread had come out good. She said her hands hurt less on some days. And then, with simple firmness, she said the Dundalk house was no longer too big because now people were coming in, neighbors, the transport driver, the center group, even an old bakery co-worker who stopped by with coffee. There was no loud joy in her voice, only firmer ground. Marlene spent Christmas 1974 in Anchorage. Nora invited her to dinner in an apartment near Spenard Road, where the table was small and there was the smell of turkey and prepared gravy. A radio played softly, and the window showed snow reflecting the light of a street lamp. 2 other hospital people arrived with dishes and contained laughter, as if they knew winter asked for company without demanding too much intimacy. Marlene brought a plate of cookies she had tried to make following one of Ruth's recipes, and no one commented that they were a little hard. They ate them anyway. After dinner, when the dishes were stacked and the conversation drifted to practical matters, tires, prices, overtime, Marlene realized she had built something that was not a substitute for Baltimore, but was life. It was not adventure. It was shared routine, with the sobriety of those who crossed dark months. In January 1975, the nights were still long, but Marlene already knew how to get through them. The small raise from the previous year, combined with occasional overtime, allowed her to save an amount that had previously always dissolved into bills. With that, in February, she bought a ticket to Baltimore with less strain than in 1973. She told her supervisor in advance and got a full week, not just rush days. The oil crisis still hovered in conversations and prices, but the country seemed to have learned a tired discipline. Lines, limits, adjustments. Marlene saw it in Anchorage and would see it in Baltimore too, and she no longer expected life to become easy again. She expected only that it would be possible. She arrived at BWI on a gray afternoon, February 15th, 1975. Maryland air had a different humidity, heavier than Alaska's dry cold. In Dundalk, Ruth's house looked the same from the outside, with the same worn step and the same clothesline in the yard, but inside there were discrete signs of change. A new bar on the hallway wall, a non-slip mat near the sink, a planner on the table with times written by Jeanette. Ruth sat in the living room, the special chairs still there, but her posture seemed less hunched than the year before. When Marlene entered, Ruth stood up slowly, using her left hand on the chair arm, and took 2 short steps without help. The movement was not pretty or fast, but it was real. Ruth's face opened into a small smile that did not depend on words. That week, Marlene accompanied her mother to the community center. She watched Ruth repeat exercises with other people, each carrying their own limitations, and saw how the environment created a collective patience. A volunteer adjusted chairs. Someone told a story about a grandchild. A physical therapist marked time with a simple clock. Ruth, when she could not find a word, did not give up. She tried another. At home, on a cold morning, Ruth insisted on helping make coffee. She spilled a little water, got irritated for a moment, breathed, and continued. Marlene did not interfere. She stayed close, ready to catch a cup if it fell, and saw there a dignity that had survived the stroke and the distance, an insistence on doing what was possible. Before Marlene returned to Anchorage, Ruth gave her something small, a new keychain, simple, bought in a little shop near the bakery, with the name Marlene engraved in basic letters. It had not replaced the old one with her father's name, lost in the 1973 robbery. It did not carry the same weight of memory, but it carried another message, recent and stubborn. There was still a future to be marked in cheap metal. Ruth did not make a speech. She only said, the words coming slowly, that it was so you don't lose it. Marlene put in the pocket of her father's coat, the same heavy coat that now seemed to serve a double function, to warm and to remember. Back in Alaska at the end of February 1975, Marlene entered the apartment near Lake Otis Parkway and felt the noisy heat like a familiar presence. The windows showed dark trees and old snow. She hung up the coat, set the new keychain on the table for a moment, and only then made a short call to Jeanette, confirming Ruth had gotten home safely from transport. There was fatigue in Marlene's body, but it was not the fatigue of someone who had lost everything. It was the fatigue of someone carrying 2 routines and still managing to keep both standing, with discipline and bills balancing at the limit. Spring 1975 came with its usual slowness, but Marlene already recognized the signs. The light becoming less slanted, the snow giving way in sheets, the smell of damp earth appearing near parking lots. At Providence, the lab remained demanding, and the quality control she had learned became part of daily work, with regular checks and records that prevented rework and error. In April, the supervisor officially made her a reference for training new technicians, people arriving from the lower 48 drawn by the same set of promises and fears that had once arrived by mail for her. Marlene taught without theatrics, showing how to check reagents, how to record results, how not to skip steps when the shift tightened. It was a small role, but stable, and that turned into slightly better money and predictability, rare enough to be valued. In May, Nora asked Marlene to drive to Tunigan Arm on a clear Sunday. The tide was low, and the mud shone in the sun. They stopped at a point where you could see the cut line of mountains, and, closer, the road line like a seam. They did not talk much. The wind did the work of filling the silence. Marlene held the keychain in her pocket, and for the first time since 1973, did not feel life was being torn from her by forces too large. There were crises, news, prices, and winters, but there were also choices that held up over time, with manageable consequences. In June 1975, a letter arrived from Ruth in handwriting still uneven but legible. Ruth wrote that she had returned to the bakery for a few hours a week, not to work as before, but to help wrap loaves and talk with old co-workers. She wrote that the boss had put a chair behind the counter and that no one pretended it was the same as the past. It was simply possible. She said her hands tired quickly, but it was good to smell flour and coffee again. At the end, Ruth wrote, with unadorned simplicity, that Anchorage seemed less far when there were concrete plans, when distance had dates and tickets. Those plans took shape in the summer. In July 1975, Marlene used her accumulated vacation benefit and bought 2 tickets for November, one for herself and one for Ruth, with a return open enough to accommodate appointments. It was not a permanent move or an impossible promise. It was a long visit carefully planned, with medical authorization and Jeanette helping organize everything, including medications, schedules, and what to pack. Ruth was not ready to live in Alaska, and perhaps never would be, but she could see with her own eyes where Marlene lived, touch the frame of the life her daughter had built, and for a few days not depend only on letters and phone calls. When November 1975 arrived, Ruth stepped off the plane in Anchorage in a borrowed heavy coat and with the look of someone trying to understand a space too large. The cold bit lightly, and Ruth tightened her grip on Marlene's arm. On the drive along Minnesota Drive, the line of the Chugach Mountains appeared with fresh snow. Ruth did not comment immediately. She only looked long and quiet, as if learning a landscape the same way one learns a difficult word. In a simple apartment, Ruth sat on the sofa and listened to the heat crackle. She ran her left hand along the window edge. Then, with effort, she walked to the door and stood for a moment looking outside at the trees and the low late afternoon sky, with short light announcing winter. The following week, Marlene took Ruth to Kincaid Park on a day without strong wind, with pale sun appearing between clouds. They walked slowly along a short stretch of trail, stopping when necessary. Ruth breathed deeply, felt the cold air clear her throat, and said, with words still carefully formed, that it was beautiful. There is no longer the judgment of right and wrong, nor the idea that one choice had to punish the other. There is only the recognition that life had opened a second home, not to replace the first, but to expand what could still be lived, even with limitations. When Ruth returned to Baltimore at the end of the month, with Jeanette waiting in Dundalk, the airport goodbye had no desperation. It had fatigue and logistics, instructions about medications and carry-on luggage, and a long embrace. Marlene returned to work the next day, and the lab routine received her with its familiar sounds. The new keychain stayed attached to the apartment keys, and her father's coat remained in the closet, heavy and useful, as clothing and as archive. The decision that began with an envelope in March 1973 did not become a story of triumph, but it also did not end in continuous loss. It became a life with two cities inside it, one in each hand, and a large space in between crossed by airplanes, letters, counted money, and, sometimes, real presence. The robbery at the bus stop remained the irreversible crack through which the future entered, and Ruth's stroke remained the definitive mark that no choice fully protects against what happens. Even so, through 1974 and 1975, Marlene and Ruth built a stability without fanfare. Ruth relearned movements, returned to old smells, made new friends at the community center. Marlene became a reference in the lab, built a small dinner table with Nora and other co-workers, learned to cross winter without closing herself off completely. The country continued in crisis and change, with prices, distrust, and adjustments. But in that northern corner and on that Dundalk Street, daily life found a way to continue with dignity. And when the light returned in Anchorage the following spring, it came through the apartment window with the same calm as always, illuminating the plants on the sill and the box of save letters, as if confirming that distance could be great and still did not have to be a cut. Only a space crossed with steadiness until it became livable. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.